Get back into the Orioles this morning as they ride a 7-game losing streak and had this. I mean, they have to, but they chose to move on from Brandon Hyde. Joining us now, a longtime friend of ours, and of course, you see him on ESPN, part of Sunday Night Baseball. You listen to his podcast. He is the great Buster Olney, and he's back with us now here on the program. Buster, it's Glenn. It's always good to catch up, sir. Thank you for taking the time for us this morning.
Yeah, good to talk with you guys, too. I have a question. Does my caption say Buster Rhymes on it?
Does it? Because no.
It does on my phone, and that's my 20-year-old son.
I absolutely love that. First of all, I love that your 20-year-old son knows who Buster Rhymes is. Like, I feel like I'm worried that perhaps my intern, who's about the same age, doesn't know. He knows. All right, thank God. Thank God that's the case.
Yeah, he was excited last year. Buster Rhymes threw out the first pitch at Citi Field, and he wanted me to get a picture with him. And that's, something. And then when I covered the Yankees in the late 90s, Homer Bush, who was, of course, an infielder on that team, every time I'd walk into the clubhouse, he'd go, Buster Rhymes!
That's pretty great, man. That is pretty great. All right, Buster, I read what you wrote. I'm in this weird place where you and I agree a lot, and people don't always like that around here, as you know, but I don't think that Brandon Hyde deserves the blame for what's happened to the Baltimore Orioles. I do think this is how baseball works, and so I'm not surprised that Brandon Hyde got fired because this is the way that it goes. But the spotlight absolutely has to shine on Mike Elias, who it's been bizarre, utterly. I've tried using other words like incongruent, and I've sort of soft-pedaled a little bit, but I think we're at the point where I don't know what I've accomplished by soft-pedaling it. It has been utterly nonsensical what has happened over the last couple of years with Mike Elias and a group of players that appears ready as a core to take a next step forward, and the almost unforgivable way he's failed to fortify that.
It's been shocking that they haven't added pitching, that they haven't seriously invested in pitching. I've had people with other teams who say to me, look, they should have Garrett Crochet, right? They should have a major free agent at some point because of the spending flexibility they had with so many young, cheap players on the roster. And I'd say this, that the handling of Mike's handling of the last, 4 days since they fired Brandon Hyde is not only, like an idiot sports writer like me is commenting on it, people with other teams are commenting on it. Mm-hmm. Like, they are shocked that he has not made himself available to the media to this point, other than putting out that statement. And from my own perspective of having covered the sport for a long time, I don't know how you build a culture of accountability within your organization if the guy at the top of the food chain doesn't stand up and answer questions. I mean, think about every day if you're covering a major league team. When I covered Cal Ripken back in the 90s, if he made an error that cost the Orioles a game, he'd be in front of his locker after the game. That's the expectation. If Ben McDonald, threw 3 1/3 and allowed 7 runs, he'd be at his locker after the game. So the idea that the head of baseball operations hasn't gone out and answered questions about it is crazy, not only to me, but a lot of people around the sport. Now that we're in day 4 since they made this decision, can you imagine, and I know he put out a statement in which he said it's his fault, can you imagine the ridicule that a player would get if, they made a mistake in a game, had a bad game, and all they did was leave a statement in their locker?
Right.
and left it for other players to answer questions of reporters? They'd be laughed out of the yard. This has been shocking to me.
Buster, it reminds me of 2022 going into the deadline where the Orioles had shown real signs of life, and there was some thought that maybe they were going to buy and try to go for it then, and instead they sold pieces, and he said, well, we can't win anyway in a Zoom call, and all of a sudden, had to fly down to Houston to meet with the players because the players were like, bro, what the F? What is going on here? And I think some of it's an amount of awkwardness about him on a human level, and I also just think that, I was very dismissive, Buster, I'll tell you, and I'm sure you saw it in the offseason. There was a kind of random website that I couldn't tell where it was between journalism and pink slime that put a story out, and it wasn't a vetted reporter. It was about like Mike Elias and his hubris and his ego and not being interested in spending money, and there being no checks and balances in the system to have somebody go say, dude, what are we doing? And boy, it's hard to ignore that at this point. It's hard for me to say. At the moment, I completely ignored it and said, this isn't, Buster Olney didn't report this. I'm not dealing with it. But now I keep falling back on it and asking more and more people around the organization, hey, is there an amount of truth to this, that this is just someone who's completely unchecked, who has been allowed to run this organization as he saw fit? The success was enough that no one was questioning him when the new ownership came in, and this is what it's led to.
And that is David Rubenstein's job, to check on him. I had this conversation over the weekend with folks with other teams after Brandon Hyde was let go about how each person has their job, right? And they work in concert in that regard. When, Aaron Judge was a free agent, I don't know this, not 100% sure, but I know it 99% sure. Brian Cashman, the Yankees general manager, advised against the Yankees signing Aaron Judge to more than that 8-year, $320 million deal, because that was Brian being in a position where he has to be responsible for the Yankees payroll. That's his professional advice. Then it's Hal Steinbrenner's role to come in and say, Brian, I hear you. You know what? We're going the extra year because I'm the caretaker of the franchise. That's what Jim Crane did in Houston when Mike was down there. Like, they had done a great job of developing this core talent. Jeff Luhnow, their general manager, didn't want to make the Justin Verlander trade at the price that it was going to be, price point. And Jim Crane stepped in and said, nope, now's the time. The Cubs, when they did their tanking, they reached a position where they needed a starting pitcher. And they went out and spent $155 million in John Lester because that was the time. That's what David, I think, needs to learn to do, to go and to Mike and say, Mike, I hear you. You feel like you can figure this out with a bunch of one-year signings of veterans, Charlie Morton, et cetera. But you know what? There are other guys out in the marketplace. Let's go be aggressive. I've heard that the Orioles ownership was willing to spend more money during the wintertime, but Mike had a plan, and you know what? He's had success, so they deferred to him, and here we are.
That was essentially the conversation that I had with David Rubenstein before the season. That's essentially what he told me, is why would I second-guess someone that had this much success? And I understand it, but that's not. I don't think you have the luxury of doing that any longer.
And you don't want an owner who's going to come in and step all over baseball operations.
Right.
Look, I told you stories about covering Peter Angelos. He definitely did that at times, like where he had a Hall of Fame general manager in Pat Gillick, and got in the way at times. He could meddle, and you don't want that. But you want each of these guys to play their particular role. And David, having the handle on the purse strings, to basically be able to say to Mike, look, I don't like our starting pitching, the looks of it. We didn't bring back Corbin Burns, which, by the way, me, Buster, I totally get. Like, if you're the Orioles and you're a small market team, you're not going to spend $200 million on Corbin Burns. But you could spend $75, $80 million on Sean Manaea, who had an excellent season for the Mets last year. I talked to Sean the other day, and I said, hey, I've always wondered about this. Did the Orioles reach out to you during the wintertime? And he kind of shrugged. No. And that blows my mind that they weren't fishing more aggressively at the mid-tier level, those guys who were, going to get $60 to $120 million. They didn't land anyone.
Buster Olney is with us here on GCR. Buster, does this my opinion now is that if Mike Elias is going to continue to be the general manager, and I do think that's a question that will have to be revisited after the season is over. I don't think they're going to make that move in season. But if Mike Elias is going to continue to be the general manager, does the profile of the next manager have to be someone with more cachet, with more experience and success to be able to say, hey, we understand you have this data. We understand we're not ignoring it. We're not going to pretend like we're going to go back 30 years in baseball where all of the power belongs to the on-field manager, but we've got to make this more cohesive. We've got to be able to work more collaboratively, and it requires a manager that is in more of a position to be able to push back a little bit.
100%, in my opinion. And it's not only a reaction to, Brandon's time as a manager and you're looking for something different, but I think it's incredibly important for a manager to have some independence, from the front office because they're, boots on the ground. They're the ones who are communicating to the players, to trying to sell things. I remember having a conversation once with Terry Francona when he was managing the Guardians. And as you guys know, Cleveland's front office is perceived to be very steeped in analytics.
Mm-hmm.
And Tito's response to me when I asked him about this was that, you know what, these guys are really great with me. They'll bring things to me and I'll say, hey, give me a couple weeks. I have to get the player prepared. I need to be able to talk to them about the situation. And the front office would defer to Tito, right? Brian Sitker had a similar situation. The manager of the Braves, a couple years ago, the analytics department said to him they wanted to be more aggressive in their positioning. And Snitker, Ron Washington, Dansby Swanson all sat in a room with the analytics guys and said, well, here's why we like this part of what you're saying. Here's why this part maybe you can work differently. You want it to be collaborative. And I think it's cancerous if there's a perception in your clubhouse from the players that the manager's powerless and that he's essentially just a talking piece for the general manager. That is incredibly dangerous.
And to the point, I don't know that Brandon Hyde was powerless, Buster, but
right.
that statement a couple weeks ago from Mike Elias was so telling to me when he was asked about lineups, and from one side of his mouth he says, no, I'm not involved with the lineups. And then the very next sentence is, but we have an advanced team, and they have the data, and they work to set the lineups with Brandon. I'm like, right, so you are involved in setting the lineups. Like, you are. And I get it. Like, we're not going back. I keep saying, we're not, to steal a phrase from a failed presidential run, we're not going back. Like, we're not going to go back to an era of baseball where the manager is going to
It's not Earl Weaver. Earl Weaver's not coming through that door.
Correct. It's not going to happen. But it just never felt like it was truly 50-50 between, on-field and baseball operations. It always felt like it was more like 75-25, and maybe if you hired a Ryan Flaherty, who, as you imagine, is very popular in this town, perhaps he has the personality to do that, but it would just seem to me like it needs to be someone who carries a kind of a bigger stick when they first walk into the door.
Yes, and I also, and on top of what you said, and I agree with everything you just said, I also think they have to ask themselves questions about why is it that the player development of so many guys seems to have stalled. And I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that. I'm not, sure what exactly the answer is. But, man, that to me right now, besides the lack of pitching, is why is it that so many guys have reached the big leagues and it hasn't worked out? To read Stauer's comments about his experience with the Orioles. Now, he felt like he had a great spring. And then for whatever reason, he wasn't on the, they have to hear that. They have to listen to that feedback from players. And by the way, through agents, I hear a lot of this type of thing where decisions are made and the players feel like pawn pieces and they don't really know why things are being done a certain way. And whether the front office feels that's stupid or ridiculous, they need to hear it. Right? They need to process it, especially at a time when they're back to being on a 55-win trajectory.
It's good times, man. It's really, really good times. In the past, we could just blame this all on the Angelos family, and we just can't do that at the moment. That's the way it works. Buster, because I also want to bring up Juan Soto with you before but if I could, is there someone that when I bring up that profile, Skip Schumacher's name comes up a lot. I don't know how much cachet Skip Schumacher has, right? I don't know how different he really is.
He's got a lot of cachet.
Okay. Is
in the industry, he definitely right now would be a guy that people in the sport are like, yeah, we love that guy.
Okay. All right. Are there others that to you fit this profile that we're talking about, potentially to be the next manager?
Well, without having put a lot of thought, I mean, Skip, I think, is the perfect example of that, right? He's worked with the Padres. He's worked with enough different organizations where he has an understanding of analytics, but he also played. And I think that helps a manager's credibility for sure. And Skip is independent. Look, when the Marlins hired Kim Ng, he went to ownership and said, and Kim Ng was the general manager who hired Skip.
Yep.
He said, you know what? You have an option for me after this year. I want to go. If, I potentially, this could be my last year. Can you please take away that option? He was aggressive enough, self-assured enough that he was not going to stand for that. I think every team needs a manager who's strong, potentially strong, and tells people who he works for exactly what he's thinking. That to me is really important, because that's, in the eyes of the players, to have that kind of credibility is really important.
You and I haven't talked about Adley in a while, because it's funny you brought up player development. Where are you at this point with? Do you just keep writing it out and hoping that it changes? Do you go nuclear? Do you consider sending him down? Do you consider the idea of maybe he just needs to play first base for a little while and only think about hitting and not think about what do you do about this?
So, Glenn, this is a case where I feel like, since I'm not around the team, like I can't give you nuts and bolts that I don't have I don't think a valid opinion on that.
That's fair.
I would need to know more about the conversations that have gone on. Like, I know that they talked to him after last season about changes, and Adley was very open-minded to it. I heard that he was in better condition, saw him in spring training. He seemed to be good. Like, all the signs seem to be positive coming into spring training. But from the spring training to now, I don't have answers for you.
I understand that. I completely understand that, and I appreciate that you don't just want to make it up. I totally get that. I know you're up in New York. It's funny because the reaction to the Juan Soto stuff to me, Buster, it's a little similar to some of the things that we talked about when Manny Machado was in Baltimore years ago. And I think there are bigger problems, but like I was regularly one that would defend and say, look, do I wish that Manny Machado hustled? Do I wish that he was a better base runner? Absolutely. Will I live with that because of all of the other things that he does? Like, Brett Favre threw a lot of interceptions, but, also threw a lot of touchdowns. I'd live with certain things. What is going on with Juan Soto? Is it deeper than that?
It is deeper than that. We just got done. We had the Mets and Yankees on Sunday Night Baseball, and so I was around the game and watched, for 2 days watching Juan. And if I were a close friend of his, I would pull him aside and say, dude, you got to step it up. Like, you have to start demonstrating that you're excited about playing for the Mets, because what I saw Saturday, Sunday was shocking.
Wow.
It was not only not running out the ball, but coming on and off the field between innings. He's walking. He looks like my son when I told him to take out the trash when he was 15 years old, right? And I, having covered baseball in New York for a long time, man, you have to, there just has to be more than that, or the fans will turn on you. Last night in Fenway Park, he stands at home plates and hits a long fly ball after hitting a long fly ball left field. He thought it was going to go over the monster. And by the way, he wasn't the only Met who did it last night. Pete Alonso did it as well. But after the game, Carlos Mendoza, the Mets manager, was asked about it. He said, yeah, we're going to have to talk to him about running hard right out of the box. And Juan's reaction was, I was hustling. And when I was like, oh, man. Like, I do think this perception is he's going from the Yankees to the Mets, and maybe he might not be happy being with the Mets. Look, that may be true. It may not be true. He's got to find a way to get back into it. When he's not doing the Soto shuffle and he's not competing pitch to pitch, that is not the Juan Soto we saw last year, who was so phenomenal. It's going to be really interesting the rest of this week to see how the Mets handle this situation, because it's got to change.
That's fascinating. Like 2 months in and you're already at a place where you're disinterested. That is rough, man. That is rough. Of course, the Baseball Tonight podcast, you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always follow Buster at Buster_ESPN or on Instagram at Buster Olney _ESPN. Buster, is there anything else I can plug for you, my friends?
No, that's good. I appreciate it. I think I'm working on a column to give advice to Juan Soto, to Mike Elias, and other things going forward. That'll probably come out tomorrow, the next day.
I would say no matter who the manager is, to your point, like, it's time. And whether it's David Rubenstein or he deflects a lot to Mike Arrighetti, who's part of his team, not to meddle. To your point, I don't want meddling, but to say we all have to be a little more collaborative in this process, and we all have to consider things a little bit more. Always appreciate you, sir. Thank you for taking the time for us this morning. Let's talk again real soon, all right?
That sounds great. Thanks, Glenn.